For a little while now, I have been in various works with PCORI, with the American Heart Association, as a lay reviewer. I know that Erin has done similar work. And one of the things that lay reviewers are charged with, particularly in the American Heart Association, where I've done early research awards and other of their sort of substantial grant cycles, is working with the plain language summaries that are increasingly required in grant submissions and in other formats. And if anybody thumbs up if they've prepared a plain language summary for a project that they've worked on, or just sort of otherwise indicate whether it's something they're familiar with or not. Okay, there's Dr. Hernan, Dr. Brescia. Okay, so plenty of people. Well, I know Erin, right? We've been on the same committees. So it's relatively familiar for a lot of people are indicating that they've worked with plain language summaries. And so, as they're increasingly required or recommended, it's probably worth taking a few minutes to just talk about them. Like how to do them, what some of the best practices are, what some of the tools that might help with preparing them. Quick definition from the UK's NIHCR. Obviously a brief summary of research that has been written for members of the public rather than researchers or professionals. And, there are a number of reasons why they're worth taking notice of. I mean, you're being responsive to a grant and it requires one. So, worth spending a little bit of time. They're increasingly required, but they're also externally, they're often an external facing piece of a project, and are important in dissemination to participants and stakeholders. I started out doing plain language summaries for some congenital heart networks, where one of the dissemination strategies that we used with the public was to, identify new articles of sort of key importance to kind of a broad stakeholder public, and do plain language summaries in collaboration with a clinician and a parent or a family member or a patient, and write those up so that they could be presented on, advocacy groups, support group, social media, sites and sources and mailing lists in order to drive awareness of new findings of broad interest. So, they're useful to do for that dissemination piece, which again, PCORI is going to ask you what your dissemination strategy is. And a lot of kind of small grant making organizations similarly are going to, ask you to go into detail about how you're going to communicate the findings of your research to the people who are participated in it or the people who are sort of interested in it. Large grant-making organizations, again, PCORI and the American Heart Association come to mind, will include lay stakeholders on grant review panels, primarily to kind of evaluate the quality of that summary. And, while, perhaps you might think that a low score on your plain language summary is not necessarily going to make or break an application, when you think about, if you've been inside, that kind of a lot of scoring clusters around kind of like the ones and the twos for significance and impact. And so if you were scoring a 2.9 and the marginal value of kind of the plain language summary deficit pushed it down to a 3, it might make all the difference. So, it's probably worth, because they do contribute to overall scoring, marginally, but, actually, it's probably worth spending the time crafting, a good one. And it's relatively straightforward. It doesn't take up so much time, but, competition is intense, and any advantage that you can find in a submission is probably worth it. So, generally, a good plain language summary, there are some sort of bulleted points here, avoids the use of jargon, technical terms and abbreviation, and clearly explains any that must be used, at lower reading grade equivalency level as possible. It's helpful if it is formatted not too densely. And the sort of easiest way of kind of breaking up formatting is to pull things out into some sort of short bullet lists of key points. Graphical elements are like super welcome if the format of the submission allows. But, like not having sort of giant blocks of text with a lot of acronyms that are, sort of alienating and hard to understand, because most of your reviewers on the reviewer side are going to come into this with maybe like a basic sort of clinical knowledge because they're, interested or involved in, in the kind of the mission of the organization, but, are not going to understand sort of dense genetics language, sort of dense clinical language. And one of the key points, thinking about one of the things with an American Heart Association grant that you have to respond to in the plain language summary and other places is, the mission. The mission of the AHA is to like, how does this application, support the mission of the organization? And typically that's what is the public benefit. Now in the UK, the public benefit part is a little more kind of specifically called for, but even here, what will be the impact on the mission of the organization? How will this drive the futures for people affected with the condition? That kind of thing. What are the practical implications? And if it was a research article, because a lot of organizations are still going to want you to produce a plain language summary of a published research article. Again, what are the major findings without the statistical jargon? And what are the practical implications? And one, sort of newer point that people have raised about plain language summaries is that, using language and format that is easy to put through a translation engine, is helpful. Easy, sort of, so not too many nested clauses in a sentence, short sentences, again, sort of responding to the plain language, short words, common words. If you put that sort of format through a Google Translate, it comes out pretty well on the other side. And, it's appropriate to use, a translation engine in this kind of work. It reminded me when I was preparing the presentation in that, in 1946, George Orwell, my favorite author, published a short essay about six rules for writing, and basically recapitulates all of the kind of the received wisdom that I've ever read about writing a plain language summary. Never use sort of an abstract, weird figure of speech. Don't use something that you see over and over again, but never use a long word where a short one will do. These are very sort of clear rules that sort of seem obvious. If it is possible to cut out a word, cut it out. Passive versus active tense, you hear that all the time. Never use a jargon word if you can think of an everyday English equivalent. I mean, he was writing for an English audience, but clearly, like if this would result in something that sounds awful, break all of the rules. So it was interesting to see that sort of connection across history. Sort of George Orwell rules are still good even at this time. So there are a number of tools which you might be interested in, to help write one, from sort of fairly sort of complicated ones. The Cochrane Plain Language Summary tool is available online. It's a little sort of maybe too intense to be useful unless you're involved in an actual Cochrane project, or maybe sort of suitable for a PCORI grant, because it is sort of iterative, walking through the steps of producing a plain language summary according to Cochrane's specific guidelines. So, not maybe sort of good to know, but not necessarily useful in the everyday context. There's some other sort of templates and guides here. Some of the common ones that probably people have used often are finding kind of the grade equivalency level of a piece of writing. It's deeply buried in Word. I can't really remember what the sort of the click through to get to it is, but somewhere in the editing, you can pull up the grammar and it will tell you what the flesh reading grade equivalency is. And you're, usually shooting for, sort of a 4 or a 5 or a 6, sort of like on the lower end, which is accessible for people with kind of moderate to proficient, English proficiency. There's the Flesh Online tool is bookmarked here, and the Hemingway app, which I didn't really know about until I was sort of poking around for things to talk about today, is what you see on the image to the other side of the text. You put your text in there, it will sort of parse it out and say, this sentence is too long, sort of highlight it in different colors. Look at this. This word is too hard. This sentence is too long. There's active, and it will active versus passive kind of tense identification, and it will recommend sort of modifications. So I found that to be kind of cool. The writer.com readability tool also does some of that work. It did raise the question, when I was thinking about using outside tools, there have been some recent policy announcements about using generative AI at the institution. I don't think that there is kind of like any policy implications to using ChatGPT, for instance, to prepare help to prepare a plain language summary. Like in everything, you shouldn't put something into ChatGPT and sort of just use the output without sort of taking a look at it and modifying it in some ways. But also many publishers and grant-making organizations have policies and requirements and considerations about using generative artificial intelligence in grant writing. It's often prohibited, and there are sort of internal concerns about putting data into ChatGPT that's not necessarily kind of private. We don't have a sort of a firewalled model at Nemours at this point where you can sort of safely put clinical data in and not have it be exposed and not violate privacy. But it does depend. Probably if you're considering using one of these external sources, you might want to just make sure the AHA does permit the use of ChatGPT to create, edit, and proposal submitted, although you must disclose it. And I think that presumably if you use ChatGPT to present your plain language summary, you would include a note that said this plain language summary was prepared with the assistance of a large language model generative AI. The NIH specifically prohibits the use of generative AI in peer review. I read their policies, and other people may have more insight into this, but I did find them a little bit ambiguous outside of kind of just the peer review. So whether or not you could use ChatGPT in sort of preparing an application or parts of an application just bears a little bit of further scrutiny. Be interested to know if anybody has knowledge about that. But just sort of below the text here, there's just an example. I took an abstract of a paper that I wrote last year and put the abstract into ChatGPT and said, please modify this as like a plain language summary, or sort of simplify the format for a kind of a 4th or 5th grade audience. And it actually did a pretty good job. You can see here it broke the text up. It introduced kind of the bullet list. I didn't ask it to do any of that. That's kind of the first natural response that it made. There was no apparent like hallucinations in the text that it generated. It seemed sort of to be pretty sort of congruent with the abstract, and also congruent with Orwell's rules. So if allowed, I thought it did do a pretty good job, because over time, working with the different organizations, I've seen some pretty bad plain language summaries that weren't plain language, or that didn't really modify the original work, or didn't explain concepts and outcomes and goals very clearly. And so, during the grant making process, I have marked them down accordingly. I have a list of criteria with a plain language summary, and I'm going to respond to it honestly. And if I see a bad plain language summary, I'm going to give it a bad grade. And again, that will contribute to overall scoring in a marginal sense. So those are some ideas. And if anybody has any comments or questions, I'll be happy to take them.